Welcome to the ReGen Brands podcast. This is a place for consumers, operators, and investors to learn about the consumer brands supporting regenerative agriculture and how they're changing the world. This is your host, Kyle, joined by my co-host, AC, who's going to take us into the episode.
On this episode, we have your two favorite podcast hosts. Yes, just Kyle and myself today. It has been 29 episodes since Kyle and I jammed out together without a guest, and it was definitely just the perfect time to do it again. It was not planned, but it worked out pretty well. Similar to episode 16, we spend a great deal of time breaking down things we've learned from all 44 episodes, the 42 blogs, and the more than 1,000 conversations that we've had collectively with and about regenerative brands. Quite simply, we talk about the biggest problems facing regenerative brands and what we're trying to build to help fix them. We do an in-depth into the what, the why, the how on the ReGen Brands media platform, the Regenerative Coalition Trade Association, and Outlaw Ventures' new early-stage regenerative CPG venture capital fund. A lot packed into this one, folks. We hope it's fun, informative, and we would love your feedback. Let's go. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the ReGen Brands podcast. We got a little special flavor for y'all today. It is just Kyle and myself. We were actually stood up by a brand guest that will remain nameless. But we sat here and said, do we just skip another week? Do we do a little solo episode that we're entirely unprepared for? And we said the good, awesome listeners of the ReGen Brands podcast, they deserve some fresh content. So here we are.
We're here. And, I'm almost confused about what to do here because I'm so turnkey on this first question and I can't ask myself. So it's going to be weird. Anthony threw together a quick list of things to discuss. And we're just going to kind of free flow and see what happens here. I should also mention for those listening only and not watching, we are both wearing glasses today for the first time because we're trying to be more articulate and no idea how this is going to work out.
Kyle's like Ricky Bobby in the I don't know what to do with my hands interview. He just doesn't know what to do with himself without his first question.
It feels like there's so much more pressure when it's just the two of us, It's like people are relying on us for information rather than us getting information out of other people. I guess that makes my hands do weird things. But, we got a few things we want to try to discuss. Anthony and I are lucky that we've learned a ton from all these different brands who we have on. So we're going to use this as an opportunity to kind of recap some of the learnings and see if we can hone in on some of the common themes that, like we've done in a previous episode. So I think, one of the first ones we really want to dive into is the operational differences between, operating a regenerative brand and a regular CPG brand and what, sort of challenges that presents and why the strategy should be different and how strategic partnership with either certain retailers and or distributors could make life, hopefully in theory, a little bit easier for regenerative brands. The first one, when I think about an operational difference between a regenerative brand and a conventional brand is supply chain and sourcing, because as we've discussed over and over and over again, developing a regenerative supply chain is one of the biggest challenges for a regenerative brand. It's not, you can't just walk to the commodity market and say, hey, I'm looking for corn. You've got to find regenerative corn, which comes from a specific farm, which isn't siloed in the same, holding facilities as the non-regenerative grain. And it gets really hard. And then not only is it hard to source up front, it's hard to then scale because as you grow, you've got to maintain that supply with every new retailer, with every new SKU and all of that. So it gets hard. So AC, what are your thoughts on regenerative supply chain? And, do you see any opportunities how do we improve that? How do we make that better or how do we make that easier?
Yeah. To add some context to what you just said, which I thought was a great way to get us started is, the average brand, in my opinion, from what I know, they're basically just working with co-mans and co-packers, right? And the co-man or the co-packer has an ingredient list. They have a ability to make XYZ product, and you're basically you're outsourcing on that person to basically always have the raw materials that is needed to make your product. And yes, regenerative brands still use co-packers, but many of them, if not the majority of them, have upstream visibility and complexity added by working directly with farmers or aggregators of farmers or some sort of additional step that most other brands don't have to deal with. And so depending on the region they're sourcing from, depending on what that crop is, that complexity could be, really interesting, right? I think of Emily at Lil Bucks and the fact that she buys all her buckwheat one shot a year, one harvest from A-Frame Farms. So what happens if that one harvest goes bad? Does she have backup farmers? Are there other ROC farmers she can source from? How does she space, how do they operationally plan to produce with just that one shot of buckwheat over an entire 12 months, right? How do you bake that into forecasting and inventory levels and production and when you're going to get POs? So,
Right.
Not to get too much in the weeds, but I think that the hardest things are supply of regenerative raw materials is constrained, right? It's not as much as we'd like it to be. And there's usually a time constraint around the fact that many of these dedicated sourcing programs are focused on a farmer or a certain group of farmers that are, limited in terms of the amount of harvest they have just because of the way that time and weather and, the calendar works.
I think it's a really great point, and it makes me want to shout out all of the regenerative founders that are out there right now, because you just mentioned one aspect. We're talking about the first difference between regenerative CPG and regular, right? Conventional, commodity supply. And what you just spelled out really eloquently was like how much more complex it is to source product. And these are generally the same founders. It's not like they have a sourcing team who's handling all this and all these different relationships and all this complexity and all this nuance. It's all really down to the founders, especially in early stage. So just the level of pure like things to manage, like bandwidth being spread out and under resourced. I mean, these founders are just under so much pressure to, I mean, literally just find their ingredients in addition to everything else that they've got to deal with, from finance to sales to funding to marketing to strategy to 3, 5, 10 planning. I mean, it's overwhelming to think about. So yeah, I think that's a great call. And supply chain really kind of segues nicely into innovation. As these new brands, these regenerative brands, are looking to build their SKU portfolio, they've got to ensure that the claims they're making, these regenerative claims, are upheld with every new product that they bring to market. So that really gives them a couple of different choices. There's number one, you can continue to iterate off your existing supply chain with different flavors potentially, right? So let's say, we'll continue with the Little Bucks example you provided. Like, how do we make more stuff out of buckwheat? And for Little Bucks, that really is sort of their niche. So that might not be the best example. But for another brand, like let's say Artisan Tropic, who has cassava chips, and I think they've got a few like plantain chips, right? There's multiple ingredients there. Do they continue to innovate on those two different formats, or do they try to include something new, a new ingredient? And if so, like, how do they ensure that that supply is regenerative? And then from, again, not only is it regenerative, is there enough capacity from the growers, and do they have the relationships to source enough ingredients to like bring these products to market? And especially like as the regenerative brand grows and scales, you open up all these different retail doors. And when you launch a new product, you want to launch in all the doors that you already have open. So every time you launch a product, assuming you've grown year over year, your initial supply requirements increase because you want to open up all those new doors. So it becomes harder and harder to grow and scale the further into that journey you are. Long story short, innovation's hard.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on innovation?
Yeah, I think you brought up some great points. And it seems like the brands that are having the most success are doing what I call commercializing the rotation, right? So you look at some of the agroforestry systems we've talked about, like what Good Sam has or what Artisan Tropic has, and them taking the rotational crops on top of their main hero ingredient and then commercializing those.
Right.
But something else we've talked about that adds another layer of complexity there is each channel in retail is a different business. And for those non-hyper CPG focused people, channel is like the section of the store and the section of products you're in. So for a company like Good Sam, it's a totally different business to operate coffee and chocolate bars or bag nuts, right? And I think they're doing an amazing job. And I think a lot of other regenerative brands are doing that, but that is very anti best practices of conventional CPG, right? And so it's really similar to the upstream sourcing complexity. Is like, how do we make space for uh, more diverse and elastic solutions rather than having to be so concentrated and so focused on these like specific things. Um, and I think the brands that we're talking to are doing that work and blazing those trails because I don't think they exist today, really.
I think you're right. I think there are very few brands who have done that well. One of the few that comes to mind would be like Primal Kitchen. I think they've done a good job kind of spanning
Mm,
multiple categories. Another good
mm,
non-regenerative brand who I think is probably has done a better job of this than anybody right now is Siete, starting in
mm,
chips, working their way into seasonings, into sauces, and canned beans. They've really taken their primary value proposition, which to me is really like clean, authentic, cultural, culturally relevant food.
mm,
And the other big value proposition for them is no seed oils really, and no
mm,
non-PUFA oils. And I think that
mm,
that's an interesting brand that some of these other brands like Good Sam can kind of like look to as like how do we emulate this path of success that Siete is like really really done a fantastic job of doing.
mm,
Um, One of the other things that came to mind as you were talking about the commercialization of the rotation
mm,
is the benefit that that has both for the farmer and for the land, right? Because if
mm,
regenerative brands continue to source more product that are diverse from the same plots of land, you're incentivizing rotation, which is increasing biodiversity, which is benefiting soil health, which is increasing carbon sequestration, water retention, all those other benefits that we talk about with regenerative agriculture. And it to me, it just feels like the right thing to be doing, right? And in addition, it gives the farmer more opportunity to sell product to the same trusted vendor. So it
mm.
increases their quality of life, increases their profitability, their resiliency, their lack of dependence on a single crop. So I think to your point, like the commercialization of the rotation is imperative for regenerative brand success and also just has so many different cascading benefits.
Hmm. Yeah, and the amount of times that we have had a brand talk about how their innovation pipeline or strategy or whatever they're selling now is really farmer led, I think is super admirable, and it's why I think you and I are so passionate about trying to support these brands. Is like that is exactly the kind of win-win, strategies that we need. And if you look at the large multinationals, a lot of the big problems I think that we're facing are the farmers are just trapped in those commodity supply chains and they have no seat at the table in terms of, hey, I don't want to grow corn and beans every year for the rest of my life ever again. What else could we do here? Whereas the brands that we featured on the show are really boots on the grounds with farmers. They have the farms themselves or whatever it may be. And they're saying, hey, I'm already selling these one or two things for you. What about these other three or four things that you're growing alongside of those? How can we help? How can we help make those a premium offtake for your operation, right? Because that is ultimately what gives the profitability to enable the sustainability on all sides, in my opinion.
Totally. And it also kind of like flips the paradigm. Instead of saying like, hey, the market demands corn, everybody should grow corn regardless of climate, regardless of irrigation situation, regardless of soil type. Instead, it kind of like the farmer says, hey, this is what I can grow. This is what thrives
Mm-hmm.
for me. This is what's complementary to these other crops that I'm growing. And
Mm-hmm.
back to the land, like that's going to improve everything for, again, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, water retention, and like that. So I think flipping that paradigm, which is what regenerative brands are doing in general across the board, they're flipping all these different paradigms. That one is something that is particularly interesting to me. And I think, again, cascading benefits all the way down the chain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so
What,
I
Kyle? What do
think,
you
and,
see?
oh, go ahead.
Like, what do you see as like potential group wide solutions, or like how can we help? How can we help the brands with that? And we're gonna put ourselves on the spot and just riff on this live. But we've talked about it a little bit. But what do you see as how we can help the brands with that?
When you say help the brands with that, I'll make sure I understand the question. So is that like helping the brands flip that paradigm and like how do they tell that story to retailers specifically to generate the markets?
No, I think more just the operational burden and complexity of regenerative sourcing, right? We're talking about regenerative supply chains, regenerative raw materials. Like how can we build programmatic solutions for that for our entire cohort of brands?
Man, that is a really hard question. And outside my domain of expertise, I'm going to take a cop out on this one, but I'm going to try to riff on it and just acknowledge the fact that this is not my bread and butter. I'm
Yeah,
outside
yeah.
my skill set here. Um, but it really feels like if the goal is how do we get to a solution where it's easier for farmers to grow what they need to grow,
Mm-hmm.
um, market generation feels like the number one thing. And I guess you do
Mm-hmm.
that via the brand. So if a farmer says, they're a cacao farmer and they're like, hey, I'd really love to grow plantains, like we need to develop a market for plantains. How do we as an organization, like the regenerative movement, help to do that? Man, I really don't know. I'm just riffing and trying to like give my brain some time to think of
Yeah.
something that'd be beneficial, but I don't know what the answer is. What do you
Yeah.
think we could do to help to create a process or a system to help to solve some of these problems?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think your answer of market demand can be a solution for every problem or every added complexity we're going to talk about today. So it's always a good answer, right? Um, I think some things that I'm seeing being done in the space at a small level that could be scaled or done with greater collaboration could be really effective. Like when we went to the ROC, the Regenerative Organic Certified meeting at Expo West, and Bridget, who works for the Rodale Institute, is working on trying to create a little more collaborative, like portal and visibility for both regenerative organic certified farmers and brands in terms of, hey, I'm sourcing these three things, but I want to source these two things. Does anyone know someone that's growing that it's certified or that would plant it for us? Um, I think we need to do that at a broader scale. And we need to do that in a way that's like a centralized hub or portal where it's notated by region, by availability of timing of the year, by what certification it would fall underneath, et cetera, right? And that is a big, big task that I don't know who's the right person for. I think we've talked about it from a regenerative coalition and a ReGen coalition standpoint. It's probably not in our phase one. It's definitely something I'd like to see us work towards. But that to me of almost like a it's like a broker that the brands and the certifying bodies kind of put together collectively themselves that can work on behalf of. Right now all those conversations are very disparate, right? It's, hey, Kettle and
Hmm.
Fire sources bone broth, so they're talking about bones. Hey, this other company sources veggies, so they're talking about veggies. And it's like, how do we get both of them to talk about soup? You know what I mean? Like that
Right.
is the win. And I think that's a lot of musical chairs. And I don't know what the exact right form and function to get us there is, but that's what comes to mind for me on how do we drive supply, decrease prices, increase collaboration, and make it easier to pull through that supply from a demand perspective.
I think you're spot on, man. I love the aggregation and collaborative model that you just laid out. So, we have this group of regenerative brands who are all trying to do the right things and support farmers. And we have all these farmers who are trying to implement these regenerative practices. And, I think it's almost like a two-way form of communication, right? And it could come from either side where there's like X number of farmers who want to continue to grow more legumes because they're nitrogen fixers and they're beneficial for the soil, and the market might
Mm-hmm.
not be there. So in that portal you're discussing, it could be like, hey, we've got all these farmers who want to grow this specific type of legume, regenerative brands, like, can you utilize this? Can you include this in your product offerings today? Or is there any way you can innovate to create a market for these products?
Mm-hmm.
And then conversely, there could be a group of regenerative brands who are like, hey, man, we'd really love to have more regeneratively grown einkorn wheat, for example. And then we can, take
Mm-hmm.
that demand back to
Mm-hmm.
the farmers and say, hey, who is in the right place where they can add this to their rotation, and or grow it on a regular basis and kind of determine like how much of this can we actually get and can it meet the demand that already exists. So I think you're
Mm-hmm.
spot on. That sort of portal is a killer pipe dream. If there's anybody listening who feels like they might have the skill set to figure out how to build such a tool, man,
Yeah.
let us know because
Mm-hmm.
I think we conceptually have a pretty good understanding that it could be successful. But I do think it's outside of yours and I's skill set today, no doubt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the last thing I'll maybe add there is like a shout out to some awesome collaborative brand initiatives that are happening, like the Almond Project, right? We got Capello's, Simple Mills, and who am I forgetting? I'm forgetting one. Um,
Daily Harvest.
the Daily Harvest, yes, and their their presentation at Climate Day was like super rad, and what they're doing, guided with some help from Jesse Smith and Lauren Tucker and some others, like I thought that was really really cool. And we have to kind of come together around these certain commodities and have that specific focus, I think, to drive some change. But then we have to have some broader hub on the back end that's like doing the research and tracking of all that work, so that there's visibility for the whole ecosystem into, okay, almond supply might be a C minus right now, but like papaya is a F. And so like we really need to get 3 people on papaya, or like what, fill in the blank with whatever you want.
I think you're spot on, man. And I feel like your brain today is just operating one level ahead of mine because I was about to talk about a collaborative project similar to the All-In Project. And I appreciate that you brought it up because, for Kettle and Fire, we're really in an interesting, quote, commodity space, right? Where we essentially use a
Yeah.
byproduct of existing industries. Like nobody's raising
Yeah.
cattle for bones.
Yeah.
So we are actually looking to partner with a few other brands, and I don't want to name them just in case they're uncomfortable, but we are in active discussion with a handful where
Mm-hmm.
we utilize bones. Another brand might utilize premium cuts, and another brand might utilize what's called drop, which is basically all of the leftover meat that isn't utilized for ground or
Mm-hmm.
tri-tip, ribeye, whatever those cuts are. And
Mm-hmm.
that to me, that type of product is like if we can take that demand and say, hey, these are three well-established CPG
Mm-hmm.
brands who can buy X amount of poundage a year on whatever cadence. Can you start to implement these principles and practices where we can scale acreage because like the demand's there, we're ready to buy, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that model, like you mentioned, the Almond Project, they did some fantastic work there. That's another, before we talked about Siete and these models that have been proven to work. And I think that all CPG brands should look to the Almond Project as
Mm-hmm.
this, trailblazing collaborative effort between CPG to help to improve the way we do agriculture in new places. So
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciate that call out.
Yeah, dude, and I love the share on the kettle and fire piece. And I think what's so powerful about that example is, to me, one thing we've kind of done wrong in the space is we've allowed, the brands have totally outsourced raw material supply and that production piece to other people. And there's been no visibility, no linkage between farmer and brand. And those projects allow us to work with those aggregators or those middle supply chain entities, but in a way where the farmer and the brand hopefully have more visibility and more skin in the game, so that it's not just a constant like drive the price down through the supply chain, but like truly a collaborative effort. And that's probably a good challenge for us, is to seek out some of those middle supply chain processors, ingredient suppliers, aggregators that are sitting between some of these entities, and learn more about their work and learn more how it can be more true partnership there versus just like I'm putting in a PO and I'm buying this ingredient, or needing 10 cents off per pound of the price or whatever that may be.
I think you're spot on, man. You nailed one of the bottlenecks of why this work is so hard, and I think processing in particular for the meat industry is like that's a huge bottleneck because there just aren't that many processing facilities who do identity
Mm-hmm.
preserved, right? They typically have their commodity cow
Mm-hmm.
and people
Mm-hmm.
buy commodity level whatever, and it could be organic or it could be conventional, but for regenerative, like because the supply is so low, it's really hard for them to do specific quote runs, if you will, or maybe slaughters is the right term, which is that might not sound inhumane, but that's the reality of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to maintain identity preservation of like these are the regenerative cattle, and for them not to get mixed creates a lot of operational challenges for those processors. And without that demand, it becomes really hard for them to justify that additional workload, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's another one of the unique challenges. You also mentioned storytelling. I just want to touch on like a random, thing
Yeah.
that happened recently. I had the opportunity to moderate a regenerative panel at SproutsCon just on Tuesday. Today's Thursday, so we're 2 days out of
Tell
that.
tell people what
And
SproutsCon
one
is,
of
Kyle, just so people know.
yeah, SproutsCon is essentially like an Expo West and a miniaturized version for Sprouts employees only. So Sprouts corporate office, they all get together and they fly in a bunch of grocery managers, vitamin managers, and store managers to go to these events and learn about what's happening in the industry, what's happening with Sprouts, and they also get the opportunity to interface with a bunch of brands who go and pay to booth up, and they get to talk to all these people on a one-on-one basis, which is really really
Mm-hmm.
cool. And as a
Mm-hmm.
part of SproutsCon, they also have these panels and discussions with a few different showcase topics or brands or whatever. And Sprouts wanted to put on a regenerative discussion to teach their employees a little bit more about regen, why it's difficult, what's hard about it, the different certifications, etc. And one of the pieces I really wanted to hone in on there and kind of empower the Sprouts team, and they seemed super responsive to this, was the brand is a storytelling entity. And to your point, Anthony, with regenerative brands, they really want to showcase and tell that story for these direct farmer relationships that they have and the impact that they're having on the ground and things like that. And if the brand is the story, the retailer is sort of the microphone or the megaphone or the quote library if the story is a book, or the movie theater if the story is a movie. And the more we can partner with the individuals who are working at retail day in and day out, and to make sure that they understand the impact of regenerative agriculture from both a human health and a planetary health perspective, and can tell that story to shoppers, like the better off this movement's going to be. And I couldn't be more thrilled with the way the Sprouts team responded to sort of that call to action. They were
Mm-hmm.
very like, this is awesome. We want to do this. They were very engaged. And just a huge shout out to the Sprouts headquarter team for having the dedication to kind of put something like this on. It was super fun, super powerful, and a great experience.
Dude, love that they're doing that and love that you got a chance to participate. I think that's so cool. And I think it's a really good segue into another one of our operational takeaways, which is just ReGen Brands have to operate at the distributor and the retail level differently, right? Which we can kind of have a very high level conversation around. Do we need to blow the whole thing up? Or, it's like that revolution versus reformation. And, who knows, maybe
Right.
the system will still be, hey, go through Unify, go through KeHE, get to retail in 50 years. Maybe it'll be something totally different. I think we're clearly seeing there's a lot of flaws in the current system, not just for regenerative brands, but especially for any emerging brand, any sub 10, sub 25, sub $50 million brand. So, dude, this is your domain of expertise. So I'm gonna let you kick this topic off and just share kind of what you're thinking there.
Yeah, man. I think in order to really address this properly, we kind of have to take a step back and think about what's happened over the last 10 years. I've been in this industry,
Mm.
I think, 11 years now. And the quote
You're dating
asks,
yourself, bro.
I am dating myself. But the asks, as I'm sitting here like adjusting my glasses because I'm so old. Um, but the asks and the requirements to participate in a lot of these retailers have changed and increased significantly
Mm.
over the past 10, 11
Mm.
years. Where,
Mm.
at Kettle and Fire, the way we originally, and this is only 5 years ago, not even 10 years ago, what we
Yeah.
considered to be a good ad spend originally was if it cost $50 per store to get off shelf placement, right? So essentially what that means is if there's a 10 store chain and it costs you $500 or less to get off shelf placement, then you're in good shape. That's a good spend, right? And what's happening now, and this is primarily because of all these massive exits that get so much attention. RX Bar selling for $600 million to Kellogg, and these
Mm-hmm.
huge evaluations and this venture capital funding that comes in. The retailers have started like, we want a chunk of that. Like, these brands wouldn't be selling if it wasn't for the
Mm.
support and the velocity and the sales that they're getting at our stores. And I completely understand that logic, right? But unfortunately, what's happened is like three different things at the same time. Like, number one, the retailers kind of jumped on that philosophy as it was sort of coming to an end. So their asks are increasing as the funding pools and the exits are sort of on the decreasing side of that. Number one. Number two,
Mm.
it's becoming more expensive to operate as a brand for a variety of different reasons. There's the war in Ukraine, there's COVID, there's supply chain issues, all
Mm-hmm.
sorts of other things are happening.
Inflation. It's
So
hitting everybody.
inflation, right? Yeah. So that's part two. It's more expensive to be a brand. Retailers are asking for more, and it's also harder to raise money, right? So those
Mm-hmm.
three things are creating this compounding issue of
Mm-hmm.
retailers asking for more while brands have less. And it's
Mm-hmm.
becoming more and more challenging for especially these regenerative brands who have a harder time, harder than most regular brands raising money, don't have the same 5, 8, 9, 10 year turn and burn mentality where they're looking to, hit a certain, revenue threshold and sell immediately. A lot of these regenerative brands it's a different model. They're actually trying to do good and stay in business
Well,
for a long time.
and they're building the supply chain, right? They're not just building another ice cream with the same ingredients and a different label on it with one tweak with a better brand, right? So it's going to be a slower growth period regardless, especially if that supply chain is not fully built out. Not always, but a lot of them.
Super great point. To your point, like we talked about before, how hard it is to grow with that supply chain, right? This isn't a liquid death, and nothing against liquid death. I think what they're doing in the
Mm-hmm.
category is fantastic. It's disruptive, it's fun, it's unique, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not hard to put water in a can.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you're talking about a regenerative ice cream who is, sourcing from a very specific dairy, if Walmart
Yeah.
comes to them and says, hey, we want to put you with 4 SKUs in 4,500 doors tomorrow, they
Mm-hmm.
literally don't have the supply, and the supply to do that,
Mm-hmm.
quite possibly, I'd be willing to bet a lot, that supply simply
Mm-hmm.
doesn't exist. They
Mm-hmm.
they quite physically, like, they can't get there, at least not without years of work of developing and building that supply chain. So that's part of why it's so hard. And really, like to support regenerative brands, it almost feels like the expectations need to change. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's impossible as some of these brands. And I don't want to put uh, by name this specific retailer on the spot, but there is a very high profile retail chain, natural channel in Los Angeles that has slotting requirements that are like $2,500 per SKU on top of a free
Mm-hmm.
fill.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, what a free fill is like one free case per store to get on shelf, which is not out of the
Mm-hmm.
ordinary. But it just
Kyle,
becomes so
take
expensive to try to get on shelf.
take a pause, and for the absolute layperson, talk about all the charges from manufacturing to shelf, right? So talk about all the different dings you get as a brand by the time the bone broth goes from the factory to the distributor to actually being on the store shelf. Like just categorize those and give a frame of reference for people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even the pro to be able to handle all of them, honestly.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
can touch on what I know off the top of my head. And, obviously you've got your raw ingredient supply, like you got to pay for those. In numerous cases, you also have to pay to house those because you're not ordering product directly to be manufactured on the same day. That's just too hard, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
have to house those
Mm-hmm.
ingredients somewhere. So there's like number one, you got to pay for the ingredients. Number two, you have to pay to house the ingredients somewhere. Number
Mm-hmm.
three, you generally have to pay for your run or quote your line time or your actual manufacturing. In addition to paying for like the labor to manufacture and the machinery time and things like that, you also have to pay tolling, which I should know more about exactly what tolling is, but I think it's like a per unit charge for every unit that comes off the line.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, you also have to pay for the actual, physical case, the package that the unit
The
is sold
packaging.
in, and every single one of these is increasing over the last 2 or 3 years, right?
Yeah.
From there,
And
you have to again pay to
freight.
freight,
So
right? So like once the product is
you went even
manufactured,
further. Yeah, you went even further upstream than I wanted you to go, but that's just to make the product, right? And
right?
so
Oh, and
then you
I'm
got to
still
pay to
going.
ship it, right?
Well, yeah, because you
Go ahead.
manufacture not where you house. So then you have
Yeah.
to pay to ship from your manufacturing facility to your fulfillment center. And for many brands, you might have two different types of fulfillment centers. It could be like your DTC
Mm-hmm.
fulfillment partner and then your retail fulfillment partner. So then you're shipping
Mm-hmm.
product to at least two locations, most likely three or four, because you might have different fulfillment centers across the
Mm-hmm.
country. Then you have to pay for housing at the fulfillment center. Then you have to pay to ship the product again to the
Mm-hmm.
distributors. And the
Mm-hmm.
distributors are squeezing the brands for money. They want these mandatory off invoice
So hold on
periods.
though. Hold on.
Yeah.
I want to draw a line because this is what I wanted you to talk about. Not even the manufacturing piece, but it's great that you talked about the manufacturing piece because it just shows the burden and the complexity and the amount of cost there. I'm simply just talking about finished good hits the distributor, all the things you can get dinged on by the time you get to the retail shelf and sell to the retail shelf. So give us that list because I think it's crazy.
Gotcha. So, I mean, apologies for the massive ramble prior to, but yeah, this
You're
just goes to
good.
show you the
You're good.
complexity and all the different pieces that the consumer is paying for, right? So once the product arrives at the distributor, I guess even before we get there, every distributor has a He calls it a marketing allowance. UNFI it's a BOI, about an invoice charge, which could be anywhere from 1 to 2 or more percent. So for every single dollar that goes out the door, they're automatically taking 1 or 2%. So that's like ding number one. Number two, most of the retailers out there try to get their brands to sign up for a quarterly off invoice program, which essentially means they want to see a 15% discount every single quarter. So that could be January, April, July, October, or something like that, some sort of cadence like that. These distributors will try to force brands into that system and at the same time do what's called bridge buying. And this is primarily for long shelf life products. Kettle Fire is a 2 year shelf life, which is pretty standard in the industry for anything that's shelf stable. So they will buy typically between 60 and 70% of their volume during that 15% OI, despite the fact that they're not selling it at that 15% OI. So they are padding their pockets and squeezing
Mm-hmm.
the brands again because you're not really getting any benefit for the bulk of those sales at the discounted period. In
Mm-hmm.
addition to that, they want to see all sorts of other levers and promotions and things like that. At the distributor level, we don't have to get that granular.
Mm-hmm.
Then the distributor is going to sell the product to the retailer. I don't know how deep you want to get into what that, because I mean, there's all sorts of chargebacks and crazy
Just
math that
do
happens
a
in
just
that
do
area.
Yeah, just do like 3, 4, 5 high level examples. You don't have to even put specific numbers, but like you got to pay to be on an end cap. You got to pay to be on sale. Like just Give people a flavor for that.
You really got more than you bargained for with this question. I'm getting very granular, but you're
No,
looking for the high
I
level.
think it's
So I guess
great. I'm letting you get in the weeds and go micro, and then I'm going to back us out and go macro. So you're doing great.
okay. So then you probably gets to retail, and every distributor has a different markup to that retailer, and that's not critically important for this conversation. Basically, your product gets to the retailer, and they got their margin, and then in addition, the retailers are looking for some sort of promotional support, as they should. It's got to be a two-way
Mm-hmm.
street. If they're going to put you on shelf, the brands need to support that.
Mm-hmm.
Some retailers are more affordable than others, and so they're looking for, generally speaking, quarterly promotions at a 15 to 20% minimum discount. And if you want to get off-shelf placement or an ad or something special, you've got to pay flat fees for that. At Whole Foods, you're looking at $40,000 for a national end cap, and that's a 2-week promotion. On a top of the 20% minimum requirement to spend. And I'm not necessarily trying to call Whole Foods out as being like the worst partner. If you break it down to a cost per store, it's actually reasonable. But it's just incredibly expensive. Then as a brand, what we have to try to manage here, and this is the hardest part, is what we manage what's called trade spend, right? And there's a
Mm-hmm.
specific target percentage we're trying to hit or maintain to make sure that we maintain profitability. So we want to hit, I'd say industry standards are between maybe 12 and 20% trade spend guardrail, and that's what we aim to do. And basically what that means is, for every $100 that we sell of product, we only want to be discounting or promoting at 15%, and that's like annualized across the year. So that's a blend of your quarterly
Mm-hmm.
promotional activity and your non-promoted times. Those have to balance out to hopefully hit that trade spend rate.
Mm-hmm.
I guess in addition to that, there's free fill. So to get product on the shelf, you have to give them a free case and sometimes slotting. So like Albertson Safeway wants $10,000 per store per SKU. Sorry, not per store, per SKU across the board. It's just, there's a lot. We spend a whole hour talking about these types of fees.
Yeah, and I set you up with a tough one there because it's very nuanced and it depends on the retailer and the brand. I think you handled it very well, so thank you for just giving all that information because I think there's a lot of people listening that have no idea about any of it, and you gave a great overview. Some people typically are more familiar with the e-commerce financial metrics of like CAC and LTV, customer acquisition costs, and lifetime value. And so it's the same thing if you're a brand at retail. It's basically like, I'm going to go make $1. How much do I have to spend to make that dollar? And that basically is your profitability. And so that's why I think we're just to bring it back to the macro of this is why this conversation is so important for Regenerative Brands is we have to make that more feasible, especially if they're doing more work upstream. Like how do we reward all the extra effort, all the extra complexity to make a better product, to source better, to treat farmers better, to treat the earth better in the way that it goes to market, in the way that it is commercialized. And right now, I think we're seeing retailers make high-level commitments. They're showing preference to some certain certifications that they think are great, which is awesome. But I think my challenge or what I see as the programmatic solution is how do we reduce that burden from manufacturing to shelf? How do we reduce that financial burden for brands, right? So if you're really about regenerative as a retailer, can you just not charge slotting fees? Can you just not make them do a free fill? Can you just not can you take one of those 20 things off the board just to give them some sort of financial incentive or reward for this work that's being done? Because right now they're basically choosing to do the right thing and we're passing it all on to the customer, which goes into our whole conversation around pricing, accessibility. Regenerative food is mainly for rich people right now, which is a huge problem, and we can't look at the brand and just say, here's all of our dirty laundry, here's all of our problems, go solve it, buddy. It has to be a shared risk and a shared reward throughout the throughout the supply chain. And it's really one person's fault because the whole thing is built to operate the way that it is. It's operating perfectly the way it was built. It just wasn't built correctly.
I think you're spot on, and I'll go a step further to ask for it because what you just laid out there would be like preferential treatment for these brands who are sort of doing the right thing, which don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely in favor of because they're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
But if we could even like start with equal treatment, right? Because brands that are non-GMO, brands that are gluten-free, brands that are organic, brands that are keto, brands that are paleo, they're all having their unique attributes marketed and messaged and supported by the retailer. And today, regenerative, like that's not the case. And I don't necessarily want to throw the retailers under the bus for that, That's primarily
Hmm.
because of the nuance and the complexity between the regenerative landscapes or the certification landscape today and
Yep.
how
Yep.
nuanced and hard that is. So I want to acknowledge that. But I think that's what we
Mhm.
should be striving for first is just that equal treatment. Like if this really is the future of food and this really it does have all the potential human and planetary benefits that we all know that it does, let's start there, right? Let's make sure that
Mhm.
the retailers are really shouting out from the tops, like these are the regenerative brands, and this is why and how we're going to support them. The same way we
Mhm.
support these other attributes that to me just like I mean, keto is just it's a trend. That's not it doesn't have a staying power, right? And there will
Mhm.
always be some people on keto for a period of time, but like keto's not going to save the planet. And I really do
Mhm.
feel that regenerative agriculture has the power to. I mean, I don't want to be grandiose, but it really feels like it has the power to save the planet.
Yeah, and perfect segue into the certification conversation, which I know we want to have, and it's a good space for us to kind of tie together a bunch of snippets that we probably have almost every episode, right? And what our theory of change on that, which we can talk about later once we kind of discuss the problem a little bit, is to emulate those other attribute programs that you just mentioned. Because what do they have? They have a third party that governs the validation, and they have a third party that defines what the attribute means. And right now, we have 10 people doing that for regenerative, and they don't agree with each other. So we have to find some or create some unbiased third party that can serve for that in this movement that can get that group to focus on the 80% that they all agree on versus the 20% that they don't, and help them grow the 1% of sales that they have versus fighting over that 1%. Right. And I think I'm getting ahead of myself and getting into the solution a little bit, but I want to back out into, the certification problem and really preference and disclaimer the whole conversation with there are so many amazing people doing amazing work in this space that we support. Um, you know, I, we're not anti-certification. We're not anti any one certification. We just believe that there needs to be some sort of aggregation and unification of the bodies and of the efforts to achieve a better outcome. And we really feel like we have a groundswell and a tipping point level of brand support that agrees with that of all different regenerative definitions and certifications. So I don't know. That was a big ramble. Maybe I'll just pass it over to you, brother, and see what's bubbling up on the certification front that you want to speak on.
Yeah, I think I love everything you just said. I think you're spot on in terms of like the Regenerative Coalition group, like is well represented by brands of different sizes, different shapes, different products, different certifications. And the coolest thing about it is that they all want to work together and they recognize the efforts that they're putting in. And I think the certifications generally today are sort of competing against each other, which is natural in business, right? I don't think that
Mm-hmm.
we should demonize that, but I think that it's worth acknowledging there are, the arable land in the world, 1.6% of that land is certified organic. And if our goal is to transition the other 98.4% of arable land towards regenerative, we need to focus on how we make that happen versus how we make that 1.6% of organic land better. So
Yeah,
that's like
and
critical piece number one.
the organic thing is such a triggering conversation for everyone, and so I think even maybe a better way to frame it is we want to have a market validation mechanism for net positive regeneration, for net positive gain, right? Like as much as I don't think PepsiCo just cover cropping acreage is going to change the world, like it still is net positive regenerative gain. Is it fully regenerative? What certification is it? I don't know. Let's not get in the weeds there. Let's just start with we understand we have to have market validation and incentives for farmers and supply chain operators and brands to make net positive improvement. That's it. And if you can't agree on that, I don't know what we can get you to agree on.
Totally. And just to kind of distill what incentive looks like for me, incentive
Mm-hmm.
really is the ability to communicate that value proposition to the consumer in a way that
Mm.
in an existing mechanism that they already understand, which again brings
Amen,
me back
brother.
to in-store signage. So
Mm-hmm.
like we don't want to have to make it that much harder for consumers to understand what regenerative is. We want to utilize the platforms that already exist and give regenerative its um, opportunity to shine in that same format, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to your point about like PepsiCo cover cropping, like that's a great step in the right direction. Does it qualify for the minimum for like a regenerative shout out at retail? Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
But
Probably not.
maybe they'll get there
Mm-hmm.
one day. For now, I
Mm-hmm.
think there's so much opportunity for the small, medium, and sometimes large regenerative brands who are doing the right things and maybe implementing 4 out of 5 principles in every ingredient sold. but because they're not certified organic, they're not getting any shout out, right? And I don't mean to like really hone in on that one specific organic piece right now, but essentially what we, Anthony and I really want to try to do is figure out how do we build this umbrella that allows the competing certifications today, like ROC, like SCI, like Demeter Biodynamic, Regenified, Savory EOV, how do we let them all coexist together in a way that allows retailers to say like, okay, I can't message for these 7 different certifications today, but if they all can say, this is what regenerative is, or there's some other entity to say, this is what regenerative is, and all these different competing certifications take that box, they can focus on just that one message instead of those 7, which makes it from the consumer perspective, they can focus on just that one term instead of understanding the 7 different certifications and what they mean. And that can make it a lot easier to raise awareness, to support in store, etc. Right? So that's what we really want to try to do in the certification retail relationship space today. And that's where I think there's the greatest opportunity, and it could have the highest potential impact to increase adoption and understanding of regenerative agriculture.
There's basically 3 entities that Kyle and I work through. ReGen Brands is a media entity that is a B2B source of information, inspiration, and collaboration to basically create a seat at the table for regenerative brands in the food, in the B2B food world. The Regenerative Coalition, Kyle's going to tell you what it is here in a second. Outlaw Ventures is a family office that is launching a venture capital firm to invest in regenerative brands. So we have an investment company, a media company, and we have what is now going to try to become a 501c6 trade association, which is the Regenerative Coalition, which I'll let Kyle give the history on, and then maybe I can kind of take us into present day what we're doing.
Okay, yeah, for sure. So starting back to, I think this is April of 2021, maybe. Kettle and Fire is about to launch our first 2 regenerative bone broths. So we got a regenerative beef and a regenerative chicken bone broth. As we're bringing those products to market, I was thinking to myself, it's going to be really difficult for Kettle and Fire, a brand with 30 different SKUs in the portfolio, to figure out how do we message these 2 products differently on our own in an aisle where nobody really knows what regenerative is. So I thought if we could partner with other brands who are incorporating regeneratively raised or grown ingredients into their product offerings and partner at retail specifically to amplify the message of regenerative agriculture together, we would have more success. And at the same time, back in 2021, I mean, retail still isn't really supporting regenerative all that much, at least consumer facing. I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes. I want to acknowledge those efforts. But there was like very little messaging and marketing towards regenerative at the retail space. So we could help the retailers by solving that problem for them and providing them with assets, copy, signage, etc., to say this is how you can market and support regenerative agriculture with these brands, with these solutions. We'll promote together, we'll buy end cap space, we'll support you, you support us. It's a good reciprocity, reciprocal relationship. And so we did that, and we had some great partnerships early on. Shout out to Air One, shout out to Jimbo, shout out to Earth Fair, Thrive Market. We did a cool giveaway partnership with Kiss the Ground, and that was fantastic. As we started approaching some of the bigger retailers in the space, the Sprouts, the Whole Foods, the Natural Grocers, NCG, Info, etc., the biggest pushback was like, hey, we haven't yet determined what regenerative means to us, and we're not sure that your minimum criteria is going to be the same as ours. So ahead of partnering with you, like we need to figure out what that is internally, because it's really confusing right now. So that immediately made me realize like there's a new bottleneck, right? What we have an opportunity to solve for is helping these retailers understand what these different certifications are, what they mean, and in my opinion, why they're all important, why they're all doing fantastic work, and how we can showcase that work as a unified group and coalesce around a unified message to help consumers better understand what this is and to provide retailers with that solution. So, like I discussed a little bit previously, that's what the ReGen Coalition is focused on now, is becoming that sort of umbrella entity where we are not a certification, we are not a certifying or verification body. We simply allow the different certifications to exist, and we unify that message on their behalf to help retailers tell that story.
What Kyle just shared is like, we just need to do that on a higher scale and in a more professionalized manner. And the trailblazing work that he's led and the brands that have been involved with have done is like been super awesome and super grassroots, but we have to take it up a notch. Right. And so we have been for the last, I don't know, Kyle, what has it been? 3, 4, 5, 6 months kind of noodling on how do we do that? We feel like we have the brand support, and the communication from those folks have been really awesome. And we had an awesome connect at Expo West. And so we've really just been talking to a bunch of, I would say, elders in the space and other people that are doing similar collaborative work. And we went with, or we're going with, a very time-tested mechanism, which is a trade association. And so formalizing a true trade association underneath the Regenerative Coalition banner with membership brands and with working towards basically the vision and mission of increasing consumer awareness and demand for regeneratively produced products. That's it. Like, that is where we feel like no one is doing that, and that is a huge gap that needs to be filled. And we feel like that's really the space for us to be of service. And Kyle and I put this huge, expansive strategy together that, you know, had five big buckets, which we've kind of talked about almost all of them already on the call, which were supply, markets, media, education, and financing. I mean, these are all the ways that we feel like we can help the brands. But then we had to kind of peel that back and say, okay, but where do we start? Like, what is the focus? And we came right back to the impetus for why Kyle started this work overall, which was we need to help the brands execute programmatically at retail. So what do we actually have to do that? We have to establish this framework, right, that can encompass the various certifications and definitions of regenerative. We have to create a messaging strategy and shared marketing collateral and in-store signage and execution materials that the brands and the retailers can use and share and execute well together. And then we got to get, you know, enough brands and enough retailers to adopt it. And we really feel like if we can do that, this thing will be off to the races, and this thing will be able to be marketed and commercialized in a much more compelling, cohesive, and programmatic fashion, but still embracing the diversity of approaches and perspectives and opinions in the space.
100%. And AC, you know, we spent a lot of time talking about the quote market piece of the ReGen Coalition and how the dynamic between certifications and retailers and consumers kind of plays out right now and what we want to try to achieve. I want to hone in a little bit more on the media piece and the markets piece. You know, there's something that you say on a regular basis, and I think it's spot on, and it's that these certifying agencies, like you mentioned, are really focusing on the ground principles and maybe more B2B rather than B2C. So tell us a little bit why, or talk a little bit more about why it's so important from a messaging and a marketing perspective that we can coalesce around a single message instead of multiple, and some of the work that you're hoping to achieve there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two guiding like problem statements or belief statements that we have are like certifiers aren't marketers, and one certifier is not going to win out. So if you look at that, you have to come with a solution that I think can deal in both of those constraints or in both of those beliefs. And right now, I think the brands are all doing really, really good, amazing, siloed, singular work in telling the story of what regenerative is. They're working with some of the certifications to do that. But there is this mass amount of things that everyone actually agrees on. No one's just done the work to basically put that together and gain buy-in that can be an execution, you know, way forward. And so that's really all we're trying to do. We're trying to engage with a marketing agency, probably do some research, you know, we'll do it the right way to basically get to what is that 80%, and then how do we translate it into what actually drives purchase at retail? Because that's the most important thing. Is the planet story doesn't drive purchase at retail. The farmer livelihood story doesn't drive purchase at retail. We really think it's the health and wellness story. We think it's taste. We think it's flavor. We think it's, you know, awesome packaging, branding, etc., narrative storytelling. So those beliefs are backed up by some solid data, but we're going to get some experts in here to really, I think, help us hone that, help us validate that, go into it with an open mind. We're going to get the brands involved and do a bunch of stakeholder engagement to figure that out. But we need to leave with something that I'll just repeat what I said earlier, which is cohesive, compelling, and concise. You know, that is what we need to basically make 1 + 1 = 4 instead of 1 + 1 continuing to equal 2.
I think you're spot on, and I think to give the listeners an example of sort of what we're looking to achieve. You know, we've talked about this a couple different times now with the On One project. Like, that's a great example. How do we scale that with different categories? We talked about Siete and how they penetrated multiple categories successfully. How do we replicate that elsewhere? And I think that you and I both do a pretty good job of trying to figure out what has succeeded before and how can we utilize the existing playbook to help support regenerative brands and regenerative agriculture. And to me, and I know you feel the same way, we actually both like reached the same conclusion individually and then shared the fact that we were all on the same page, is we need to develop the Got Milk campaign for regenerative agriculture. And to me,
Mm-hmm.
what's so brilliant about Got Milk is that it doesn't specify any specific brand. It's not organic versus conventional. It's just
Mm-hmm.
milk, right? But
Mm-hmm.
the whole dairy industry was willing to coalesce around that campaign, those marketing attributes. And regardless of how you do or don't feel about milk, you know what the Got Milk campaign is. And it was
Mm-hmm.
extremely successful. And if we can replicate that model for regenerative agriculture, to say, hey, for all the brands who are doing successful things in regen, like this is the message, this is the marketing. Let's work together to get this message out there so that people can understand it. That's essentially what we're trying to achieve. Whether or not it
Mm-hmm.
includes a soil mustache is to be determined, but we'll see what happens. I'm not going to rule it out.
Yeah, and I love giving the audience that concrete example. So thank you for that. And I really think collaborative efforts among brands or entities in food to make a difference, to market products, to market commodities. This is not a new this is not a new approach. Like we are totally using something that's tried and true and tested, and not always for the best benefit. I understand that with some of the checkoff programs and some of the issues that some of these things have just gotten too big and out of control. But I think what Kyle and I would tell anyone is that through all the work that we've done and probably the 1,000+ conversations we've had at this point, there is such an appetite and a desire and a commitment among the brands to work together. We just need to give them the infrastructure and the vessel to actually channel that energy, channel that capital, channel that intention into something that can go, get stuff done at scale. And so that's what we're really hopeful and confident that this will be that.
Spot on, man. I think that's one of the coolest things about the regenerative movement. And if you think about
Mm-hmm.
the reason people want to support regenerative brands, at least for the most part, in my opinion, is because they're thinking about the future. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously their brand, their organization is important to them, but they seem to have a general sense that like we can't do this on our own, and it's going to be better for everybody if we can figure out how to do it together, which is super awesome. But you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned the capital and some of the financing, and I think it's really important that, kind of taking it back to the first question, like what's harder about being a regenerative brand? I
Mm-hmm.
think that you should expand on some of your knowledge within the financing world and the capital raising world and debt financing, and explain to our listeners like what the typical playbook is for a regular CPG brand, why that may not work for a regenerative brand, and how you see what you would like to change in that space, how that could be beneficial.
Yeah. You're throwing a lot at me there, brother. I'm trying to decide where I want to start because I want to make sure
In
it's
typical Kyle
concrete.
fashion, I'm going to ask 8 questions at the same time. You know what I mean? That's just
No,
what I
it's
do.
good. It's good. That's why I love you. So we always have to start with the macro of there is no financial reward for a lot of the work being done. If anything, you're at a financial disadvantage for a lot of the work being done because right now, the commodity food system, the non-regenerative, the degenerative food system basically gets to have, they get to be subsidized, right? By government subsidies, by the way the markets work, by the world that we live in, all the things, the desire for cheap food. So, you know, breaking out of that is going to take a lot of different approaches. And I don't by any means think that the Outlaw Ventures early stage venture capital fund is the silver bullet to solve all of our problems. Like, I need to come up with a less grave analogy, but when I look at the financial capital ecosystem around regenerative brands, it's someone with cancer in their whole body. And so it's like, where do you start? Like, where do you do surgery first when the cancer is spread everywhere? I look at equity capital, I look at debt capital, and I look at philanthropic capital, and there is no consistent win-win proven flows coming in any of those buckets specifically designed for regenerative brands. There's some good efforts going on. There's some good grassroots stuff. There's a lot of people trying really, really hard, myself included, to change that. But we got to do it now. I got a text from Heather Terry at Good Sam this morning and just said, I am constrained because I cannot buy more product from regenerative farmers. They do not have someone to sell it to, and I need to better fund the brand so we can take advantage of these growth opportunities that we have commitments from if we can fund basically the lever to get them done, which that breaks my heart. And that's what the work is about. And so all that more high level stuff to come back to, you have to start with early stage venture because any sort of large scale change, you have to raise money from the people that have a lot of money. And so if you're not super familiar with capital markets or investing, like these are the high net worth individuals. These are the family offices. These are the institutions that have billions and trillions of dollars, right? Where if they invest $1 million, $5 million, $10 million into something, it's not a big amount of capital for them. And basically, as a venture capitalist, as a fund, your job is to raise a large aggregate of money, 30, 40, $50 million, and then write those smaller checks that are bigger than the individual companies could kind of go raise without an anchor investor like yourself. And I just think we're at a really interesting time where there's a lot of early stage brands with a lot of promise, and they have all these challenges that we've mentioned about being regenerative, and they have all the typical challenge of being an early stage CPG brand, but they're crushing it. I mean, they're coming through it. They're getting national distribution. They're selling, they're selling even at a higher SRP. Like they're marketing, they're growing their social followings. Like they're doing all the right things. They're just really capital constrained. It's not that they have some grave unknown flaw that makes them a bad investment compared to their peers. Like they are just very capital constrained because most investors, I don't think, understand them. They don't get the regenerative context, and they're not getting any value for all this extra credit work that they're doing that we've talked about. And I don't know if the venture capital model solves for that. I really don't. It probably doesn't, but I do think it is the best way to raise money from the people that have it, invest it, make a return, create a lot of impact and scale a lot of great brands, and then say, hey, look, y'all, this is a very viable, asset class. And basically in the fund world, you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4 funds usually well, and then you get the opportunity to innovate and maybe change some of the terms, change the time horizon, change the return expectation. But we almost have to do it the less regenerative way to start. I'm sure there's people out there that disagree with me, but that's really my theory of change is how do we create the next 5 epic, exits to General Mills? To me, early stage venture capital that is focused on regenerative CPG specifically, that can harness all the synergies of those brands, that can really be focused on that can find ways to find innovative co-investors and de-risking mechanisms and all the things. I mean, as you can tell, I'm totally going to nerd out on this and just get way too passionate about it. But
As you should, man. Go for it.
You have to start with a dedicated entity, with that focus, with that mandate that is accountable to do that. And I think the rest sorts itself out after that.
I'm curious to get your perspective on, out of all the places you could invest money, why do you feel like investing in regenerative brands is so critical to scaling this movement?
Yeah. Oh, there's so many good answers to that. And we're putting the V1, the version 1 of the pitch deck together right now. So all this is like super fresh in my brain. When you look at capital allocation to regenerative, brands significantly lag behind other asset classes. So, I look at farmland and I see that as there's probably $10+ billion of regenerative farmland professionally managed investments, right? I would say, and I haven't done the math yet or dug into pitch book yet, but sustainable ag tech venture capital, I guarantee we're above 5 or 10 billion, right? And then you look at infrastructure and brands, and I bet infrastructure's for sure less than 500 million. And I know brands is less than 100 million. And I'm talking about funds and strategies specifically dedicated to regenerative, right? And so when I look at those circles, I just say something's not right here, because all that stuff we grow outside of what, isn't food, it has to get sold through infrastructure and a brand. And so how can we have $10 billion allocated here and less than 100 million allocated over here? Like something's got to give if we're going to make that even, and if we're going to create regenerative supply webs, supply chains, and regenerative food systems. We can't have this massive imbalance. And so, as an investor, you're basically just betting that trend of viable investment opportunities is going to continue downstream because it has started upstream and done well. So that's one part of it. I think the second part of it is, look, consumer as a venture asset class that trades at a 3 to 5x type multiple at exit is proven that you can put together strategy, you can make money, you can make venture style returns. I think it's much, much, much harder to be a good consumer investor than it is to be a tech or a farmland investor. No offense to any of those folks. They're doing awesome work and I salute them and I invest in their funds and all the things. So it's harder. That doesn't mean it's impossible. Doesn't mean it can't be done. Doesn't mean it's not viable. And I think we're going to be in a really, really interesting time period where you've earlier in this show talked about the last 10 years and some of the changes in CPG. We've seen a lot of bad, dumb money come into CPG the last 10 years. We really have. And we've seen a lot of bad brands be funded that were operated under a growth at all cost mindset and weren't really that differentiated and really have not, I don't think, created lasting change in categories or in the ecosystem overall. And if we can fund and operate some of these regenerative brands correctly, they are the exact opposite profile of that. It might take a little longer. It might look a little different. We might have to flex a little bit on some of our standard operating procedures, but those are the folks that can bring the highest integrity, the most innovative, and the greatest game-changing solutions in CPG, in my opinion.
I think you're spot on, man. And I love the way you kind of framed up the way the funding model is working today with the on the ground investment with like actual conversion of acreage into ag tech, et cetera, and so on and so forth. And the way like I visualize what you were saying there is like, there's a dam, right? And the brand is the dam. And if we don't invest in the dam, like we're not going to let enough of that flow of the investment that's taking place prior to consumer adoption, like all that investment is just going to sit there until we can get people to figure out what this is. And what better way to do that than via a brand? I can't think of anything. So I think you laid that out really, really well. And you even use the term like downstream effects, right? And that's just, I think you're spot on. And it really gets me excited because, as somebody who loves the planet and loves the world and health and human health, I just so happen to work in natural food CPG. It really feels like potentially one of the biggest unlocks in helping to scale this thing is via the regenerative brand, so it gets me really excited about the opportunity. And I'm just grateful that we, somebody with your investment knowledge is here to help to work on these problems, because like I mentioned before, that is way outside my domain of expertise, and just grateful for the 1-2 collab we got going here, man.
Well, I definitely don't know everything, and I'm recruiting an epic team to help me with the things that I don't know and trying to learn every day. And look, I've placed some capital in the space, but we're nowhere near where we want to be. And I have a lot of issue with the fact that I get good deals in my inbox every week that I got to say no to because I just don't have the money yet because we haven't raised the fund yet. So my urgency is really high. I think, like Joe from Serenity Kids said on one of the episodes, the truth is on our side. The consumer trends and where, what consumers want to buy, why they want to buy it is on our side. I think the commitments that the large multinationals have played and how they're going to have to satisfy those and how they're going to have to do that through M&A is on our side. So I just think there's a lot of amazing tailwinds that we can take advantage of that right now aren't trickling down to the way the brands operate. But I think capital is the greatest way that we can unlock that for them. Capital and this whole commercialization.
I think you're right
about with the coalition.
Yeah, and to me, there's two primary reasons why it's so much harder for regenerative brands, and outside of everything else that we just talked about, from a fundraising perspective, specifically within the CPG world, right? Number one, outside of Moonshot, which was acquired by Patagonia Provisions and is sort of like the first quote regenerative exit on my radar, there isn't really a proven concept, and that was sort of a behind closed doors. We don't know the figures and that.
Let me stop you there though. The list is a little bit bigger than that. You're right. Moonshot, Pasturebird to Purdue. Some people would say Vital Farms IPO would be one. Epic to General Mills, and then some people would consider Annie's to General Mills. So it's more like those 5 in my brain, and you can tell that I've done the research to put the pitch deck together. But you're correct. Recently, that's the only one, and we don't know the financials of it. So sorry to cut you off, but I wanted to interject.
But Pasturebird, from a purely CPG perspective, Pasturebird acquisition was prior to marketing. That was more about the ag tech versus the brand, right?
Well, they were General Mills, though.
But not at scale, not like a regular CPG,
you're
like
right.
National on the regular track. So I'm just trying to think of like the regular track of like where CPG exits come from and where people look to like the model of saying like, this is a proven concept. We want to invest in the same sort of track record. There's yet to be like a real proven track record of like, this is a brand that started out as focusing on regenerative and has gone through, jumped through the hoops, gotten to national distribution, made it so they want to make it and exited. And because of that, that's like a big reason we're not seeing a lot of investment in that space right now. That's part one. Part two, I think from an ESG perspective, there are a lot of companies out there who want to like make these ESG claims, but because there isn't a accountable, and this is my buddy who works at Deloitte. He's on pre-partner track. He works a little bit in the ESG space, and he says that one of the biggest things holding ReGen back is the lack of agreed upon science. Is how do we track these ESG claims? The fact that we can't track carbon sequestration and quantify that value benefit so that people can put it on their quarterly earnings statements makes it more difficult for those large investment firms to want to invest in this space. So if we could figure out how to do that, I think that could open up some doors. To me, carbon sequestration is kind of like a Pandora's box where the science doesn't really agree on anything right now, and it seems really, really hard, and it's a huge uphill battle. I don't know if there are any additional claims we can make about improving soil organic matter or water retention rates, and like you can throw that on a statement somehow and it makes sense. But those to me feel like two hurdles, burdens, whatever you want to call them, holding back the potential flow of capital into the regenerative CPG space today.
Yeah, I'll start with the second one first. The second one, agree. There's a lot of work and money being put into that. You look at like what a General Mills is doing with a Qantas and a Regrow to track their supply chain or track significant parts of their supply chains and regions and quantify some of those environmental metrics. You look at some of the startups in the space like Emerge Impact and many others. And sorry if I forgot to mention you, all the homies out there. But I think there's a ton of effort and money that's going to go in, and we're going to solve that problem. So I'm going to put that one on the shelf and say, we will have a solution for that. Will it be the perfect solution? Will it be the most equitable solution? Will it be properly priced? I do not know, but I believe we're getting closer and closer to quantification and scientific rigor that can do some damage there. The exit piece is what the exit piece is. It's really hard to have a proven exit when this term is still very new. Obviously, the way of farming is not new.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can do some organic comps. I am going to go out and tell, potential investors in the fund that all 5 of those exits I see as viable exits that are relatable to the path that we're trying to blaze. And I think you can look at some players that haven't exited. I mean, Nature's Path, Dr. Bronner's, Lundberg, like, I don't know for sure, but my assumption is all those businesses do over $100 million. Simple Mills, and just because they haven't exited, they've created really, really healthy businesses where, yes, they have regenerative programs by name and certification now, but some of those products are not any different than they've always been, and they've always been regenerative. So I think you're correct, and I would add that context to it is all I would say on the viability, the proof of concept, and the exit scenario.
No, I think that's the right, as a salesman, I hate to use the term spin, but I think that's the right perspective to bring. You know what I mean? So it's like you're looking for those, maybe not 100% the exact, RX bar or Lily's chocolate model, right? But close enough to really say, like, you can make a legitimate comparison and say that, this is why I believe this to be successful. There is an established track record. And I think that's really important to bring to the table. Because, I mean, to my point, like, my brain doesn't register those as the same exact, CPG, VC-funded exit success story. And I think that maybe I should reframe my perspective to put those into the realm of like, regenerative is maybe more of a viable, tried and true concept than I had previously taken it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to name names, but I think we have a nice cohort of plus 50, plus 75, plus $100 million brands that have not exited yet that will in the next 3 to 5 years. And so that I think will be good win for our sales on the fund side and good momentum and add to that list.
Totally agree. We have a few more things on this list that I don't know if we have time to go through, man. I think how long have we been going?
I think we call it. We're like right at 15 minutes past the hour. This was really good and whole and complete. And I hope it's informative for people. I think we get so used to trying to make sure whoever the guest or guests story comes out that we maybe talk to each other about a lot of this stuff. And I know we got a lot of positive feedback after episode 16, the last time we did this. So we'll see what people think. And if it's something that they want to see us do more, we'd be happy to do it.
Yeah, I agree. It'd be cool to get, a list from users, what do they want us to talk about, if anything?
Yeah.
What do they want to hear our perspectives on? I think that could be cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the call to action for audience is, let us know what else we're not talking about that you want us to. And if anything that we talked about today resonates and you want to get involved and you want to help, like, we are all about collaboration, and rising tide lifts all boats. So let us know.
For show notes, episode transcripts, and more information on our guests and what we discuss on the show, check out our website, ReGen-Brands.com. That is ReGen-Brands.com. You can also find our ReGen recaps on the website. ReGen recaps take less than 5 minutes to read and cover all the key points of the full hour-long conversations. You can check out our YouTube channel, ReGen Brands Podcast, for all of our episodes with both video and audio. The best way to support our work is to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to future episodes, and share the show with your friends. Thanks for tuning in to the ReGen Brands Podcast, brought to you by the ReGen Coalition and Outlaw Ventures. We hope you learned something new in this episode, and it empowers you to use your voice, your time, and your dollars to help us build a better and more regenerative food system. Love you guys.